people
Could
have
I come in there for a second,
sure.
William? I think it's really interesting because, I come from a different background, not a medical background, but I'm an engineer by trade. So, I'm very interested when you mentioned the loading, because basically in simple terms for anybody listening to this, if you're going to damage something, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can do it in tension. So you're basically pulling something. You can do it in compression where you're squashing it. You can do it in torsion where you twist it, or you can do it in bending.
And all those things apply to muscles.
And all of those things apply to muscles, and they can all be applied to the bones as well. And if you look at the human body as kind of a system or a machine, it's, if you look at, say, compare it to the design of a car, when the car is driving down a bumpy road, you've got your suspension and you've got your shock absorbers. But if you look at the human body, you've got the cartilage, which is more or less acting like a shock absorber, but you've got no springs.
That's
so,
right.
there's only so much you can do in terms of preparing the body. And I think, there's been massive advances in sports science and in the medical care and the quality of preparation of the players. But at the same time as you've had that with professionalism, you've had this massive ramp up. I think it's easy to underestimate just how much more powerful today's players are. They are so much quicker, so much physically heavier, and so much more muscular. So they generate an awful lot more power. And yet it's ultimately pretty similar cartilage and pretty similar bone that has to resist.
Yeah, I was astonished about 2 or 3 seasons ago before an international, and was reading down through the players' list and came to Brian O'Driscoll. At that time, Brian, do you remember that there was a period where Brian was very heavy, where he weighed over 15, I think about 15 and a half stones, which isn't heavy rugby. We don't think of that as heavy. In 1965, when he got his first cap against South Africa, Bill McBride, second row, weighed 15 and a half stone.
That's right,
You think of him as a big guy. So yes, I mean, that's one of the problems I was going to say is that, everybody in television around the ground loves the big hits. They think it's, oh, look at that, but it's not as terrible. It's going to be, become a serious injury if the upward curve of physicality and power to strength and so on and speed ratio keeps increasing. It's, so with Jonah Lomu, 12 years ago or 15 years ago, whatever it was, the sheer fear that guy would put in anybody, and yet more and more people are turning up like him and playing in the backs. It's very serious.
That level of power has been generated, and the studies of that. It's much more difficult to kind of study and analyze what's happening in the very dynamic situations. But things like, for example, the scrums have certainly been studied, and that's a much more static force. So provided your technique is okay, as you say, the chances of injury there are probably less, in fact, than something like the tackle situation. But I mean, players at the top level scrums now, the force there is basically equivalent to 2 small family cars, parking bumper to bumper and then accelerating against each other. And when you think about all of that force going through a relatively small area, which is the human neck and the shoulder joints, it's an awful lot to expect people to go through a professional career experiencing that kind of loading and not come out the other side with some kind of damage. And the repetitive injuries are probably another area I'm sure you're probably going to tell us more about there.
Yeah, it's the constant recurrence of these players exposing themselves week in, week out to this level of violence on the field. And I mean violence, legitimate violence, is quite worrying. The thing about it is, of course, with injuries, is that muscle injury is usually pretty straightforward. It will repair itself. It's the damage to joints and connective tissue that's the real difficulty. Muscles will heal because they're fully supplied with nerves and blood and will repair themselves. Tendons and ligaments, not necessarily the case, and certainly cartilage, once it's gone, it's pretty much gone. So most of the time, though, I mean, injuries are fairly obvious and people will get them treated. It's people who ignore injuries and play on, and perhaps Brian O'Driscoll shouldn't have played in the World Cup at all because of his injury, so that's another issue.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt he shouldn't have played. I mean, you can see that now. I mean, medically, I'd say, but that's pretty inarguable. But do you want to be the guy that tells Brian O'Driscoll he's not going to play? I suppose
yes,
that's
but somebody should have. I mean, it wasn't his decision. It's not his decision whether he plays fit or not.
No, I agree.
One of the things. Most of the research in sporting injuries has actually been done in America in the NFL and so on because they're very litigious there. So they're beginning to look at injuries and how they occur. And I don't think we'll be far behind in saying, okay, you can't get players onto the field at any cost. I mean, that's what Bloodgate was about, really, wasn't it? You remember when Harlequins brought on, who was the injured player?
Tom Williams was supposedly injured. Nick
Evans.
Nick Evans, I beg your pardon.
And he shouldn't have been put on the field because he was badly injured.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
was despicable. Yeah,
it was, and I mean, I think there's a question of professional ethical responsibility there from the Harlequins medical staff. But one other area which I think hasn't received an awful lot of attention, even for kind of the rugby junkies like us who would kind of keep up to date with what the latest thinking, as kind of an armchair observer, what the latest thinking in sports science is and so on, is that one thing that happens when you damage something, you can damage something by just applying a level of force that it actually breaks or causes instantaneous damage. But there's another type of damage too, which happens over time, where basically you accumulate damage on a microscopic scale, which eventually causes something serious to happen. And with the kind of level of forces that people are having applied to their bodies now, I think we're going to see an increase in post career or late career breakdowns of particular joints and particular bones, and what we would call as engineers fatigue injury.
Yeah, but if you take that a step further, the most worrying aspect of it is, okay, yes, you do have arthritis and so on, which develops, and you see some ex-rugby players who've played at a high level, and they hobble about the place, and their lives are pretty pain rattled. But the most worrying thing for me are the levels of concussion that are occurring, and with the research that's being done. Now, I've been out of the loop because I've been retired for quite a while now, but I've been recently I'm still a member of some organizations that give me information. Some information is coming out of the NFL with regards to concussions is very, very worrying, and it would be equally applicable to rugby. Not just as we don't have the same level of collision, but those guys quite often lead with their heads. The helmet doesn't give them any protection at all. It stops them getting cut, but it just means their brain takes all the force because it rattles around inside the box of the skull. I think that's a point that kind of lay people don't really appreciate about concussion. They think it's kind of the bang on the outside of the skull, but concussion injury is actually where your brain can't keep up with the movement of your skull. So it's a bit like sitting on a bus without a seatbelt and the bus stops. You go flying and get bounced around the bus, and that's basically what's happening to your brain, and that's where the concussion is coming from. Most people have in their lives have stood up from a chair far too quickly. And you get a massive pain in your head because when you stop, your brain continues to go on up and it actually forces itself against the top of your skull. So you get pain and you get headache and you get stars before your eyes. That's a minor version of what actually happens. And that's just from standing up. Brain is an incredibly delicate organization, and the statistics of the numbers of concussions that can produce fairly catastrophic lifetime injuries aren't very many. They're talking about maybe as few as 5 concussions. And
I think as well, as you say, and you've implied there with just the number, I mean, it's the cumulative damage that comes from these that builds up and causes the real problems for people. And, it is really the elephant in the room, or kind of the time bomb waiting to go off. And, the American research is pretty convincing from what I've seen on it. But, the factor, I suppose, when you apply it to rugby, we don't have the helmets, okay, but as we've said, there's not necessarily a huge amount of protection there. But, we also, if you look at the nature of the game, there's rugby is a much more dynamic game, and the players are involved in the play for longer. So I would say the number of collisions per player per game is probably higher. So
it is, yeah. It just some of the recent stuff in America, they examined the brains of six dead NFL players who had all been professional players. One in particular was quite startling. Is a guy called Tom McHale, who played for Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This was a guy who was a graduate of Cornell University. He was a restaurateur after he retired. He was a family man with children. He became, because of the injuries that he sustained in his 8 or 9 years, I think it was, playing pro football there, he became hooked on strong painkillers. And eventually he died of a drug overdose, and I won't go into any more of the details of his personal life, but it was pretty horrible at the end. When they did the autopsy, they found that he was suffering from a very severe degenerative brain disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. They also discovered in 6 other NFL players between the ages of 25 and 50 who had died and who had suffered concussions. They all, including one very famous one called Andre Waters, they had all suffered pretty substantial emotional and behavioural problems after their playing days were over, with erratic behaviour and drug abuse and suicide in some cases, or dying of overdoses. And these are all people who had suffered pretty severe concussions. Even one young kid, an 18-year-old, who had suffered concussions, was found on autopsy to have pretty severe signs of brain lesions, similar to what you find in Alzheimer's. So it's vital that rugby players will recognise the symptoms of concussion. You know, headache and dizziness and feeling as if you're going to chuck up your tea, and even emotional status, becoming tearful or wherever. We all want to play. You know, I remember back to my playing days, and no matter what, you wanted to play. You wanted to get in the game, so sometimes you play when you shouldn't have done. But these issues are far too serious. They find, for example, that over 6% of NFL players were suffering from dementia, as opposed to what should be about 1.2% of the population. So there is a big issue between concussion and what happens to people later in life, just as there is in a much more probably widespread and maybe but less serious way in terms of joint trauma with arthritis and aches and pains and neck pain and so on. It's something that needs to be looked at, and I don't know what you can do about it. Love the game too much, I think, to try and tamper with it too much, but it's something we need to be aware of. Perhaps players, if they are concussed, need to have an 8-week break as opposed to checking a brain scan that was done at the start of the season. You know, to me, I think that's essential. I don't want to be, to produce a big downer in the sport, but it is something we need to worry about. We have 2 players who had to give up because of concussions this year, so.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say there is that, we went from the amateur era where we pretty much had a 3-week kind of set aside for concussion.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly there was players who just kind of sidestepped that and played on anyway. But, when we went into the professional era, we undoubtedly saw a lot of people just sidestepping that issue because it was their job, and they were afraid if they were out of the team that they were going to suffer. And in many cases they were under either explicit or implicit pressure from the coaches or the management teams of their team. Particularly if they're a star player, not to come out as concussed. Yeah. Hey, it's just a bang in the head, you'll be okay. So, I somewhere in there, there's a better system, and I think, there are some advantages to the newer system, but I think that's open to abuse too, and it's, as you say, undoubtedly something, we've got to get a grip on in the game, and not something we're going to get the answer to tonight in a discussion, that's for sure.
Yeah, I can remember way back, when I was playing in the 1970s, a referee in one game ordering a guy off the pitch because it was obvious that he was concussed. And I've seen professional players stumbling about the pitch with their physios come on and they're not taken off. The referee should send them off, for their own good. Tell them to get them off the pitch. I think the referee should be given, if they don't have that power, they should be given it.
Yeah, that's absolutely unbelievable. William, I especially liked the way you took us through the whole animal kingdom and the structure of the human body and that kind of thing. Unbelievable insight. And Doc, yourself as well, it was like being in a physics class where I was really interested in finding out more about force of things. It was unbelievable stuff. I'm afraid we're out of time here on Talking Rugby this evening. What a terrific insight by William and Doc. I want to thank all of our guests. Pedro, our exotic tip man living in Cork, Doc, our Leinster fan, and William, our dedicated Ulster fan. Thanks, lads.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks, lads.
You're listening to The World's Talking with Dave O'Grady. Don't forget, if you have a story, an internet forum, a discussion you want to have, email theworldstalking@gmail.com. That's theworldstalking@gmail.com. Don't forget to click like on Facebook, like on Twitter, like on everything, and we'll chat to you then.